This video is going to be a rundown on some miscellaneous developments that have occurred in the Ukraine war. Perhaps the most notable of these developments occurred on April 21st. On that day, Russian forces had announced that they have completely secured the city of Mariupol. The remaining Ukrainian fighters, the vast majority of which belongs to the Azov battalion, are holed up in the Azovstal steel factory, which of course is isolated from any residential areas. Of course, being surrounded and trapped in a bombed out steel mill means that there is a lack of food, water, and medicine for the injured fighters. So it's only a matter of time until they either die of thirst and disease or are forced to come out and surrender unconditionally to the Russian forces. What I found interesting, and what I also want to mention, is that British intelligence reports are trying to portray this as some kind of fierce resistance, which is preventing the Russian forces from gaining control of the city. And all I'm going to say about that is that there is a video on the internet which shows the utterly precarious position that these fighters are in. And of course, it's a video that I am not going to show on YouTube because of the gore factor. Long story short, there are wounded men, there are sick men who are basically rotting alive under their blankets. The location that they are in can only be described as a catacomb. They are underground, and if they come up above ground, they are going to be shelled by artillery, including some very heavy guns like the 2S4 Tulpan, which I will remind everybody drops shells that weigh 150 kilograms. The only reason that they are still alive is because they are underground. Now, imagine what happens to somebody who was injured in battle 2 or 3 weeks ago, or even 5 days ago, and they are trapped in this underground facility without any means to sterilize their wounds. On top of that, they have very little water or food, and the water that they do have is probably contaminated. At least some of it is likely contaminated. So given this setting, imagine what happens over the course of many days and many weeks. What happens is a major health hazard to not only the people who are already injured and literally rotting and festering alive, but also to the healthy and uninjured soldiers who are trapped with them. So to describe this as a force which is fighting heavily and which is offering fierce resistance is nothing but wishful propaganda. The fact of the matter is that the Russian forces that are in Mariupol are already being redeployed to other locations along the Donbass main line of contact. Now, the clown world assertion that Russian forces cannot establish dominance in either the air or the sea is just something out of this world. That is something that I will have to cover in another video. Anyways, moving on to the situation along the main Donbass contact line. What we are seeing there is a series of very heavy artillery and airstrikes. Overall, the fighting has subsided in preparation for Orthodox Easter, but that doesn't mean that the Russian forces are going to stop shelling or bombing Ukrainian troop concentrations along the contact line. This is exactly what they are doing. And every source suggests that this shelling is extremely heavy. There are Ukrainian sources on the ground who say that this shelling is unlike anything they've ever seen or prepared for. There are captured Ukrainian prisoners of war, mainly those enlisted in the Territorial Defense Forces, which is essentially a paramilitary organization. After being sent to fight the Russians, these forces tend to surrender basically after the first shelling. And there is also the Russian Ministry of Defense, which talks about the number of targets destroyed by artillery in their daily briefings. And every single day they state that over 1,000 targets are struck by artillery, the majority of these being concentrations of manpower and equipment. So in short, we likely won't see any major advances along the front line before Orthodox Easter, but we will see more of this heavy shelling and more of these airstrikes. Another interesting development is the fact that Russian forces have seized an enormous munitions facility near the Ukrainian town of Balakleya, This munition storage is said to have tens of thousands of tons of ammunition. It is claimed to be the largest single munition storage in all of Europe. And most of this ammunition comes in the form of 152mm artillery shells. 152mm is the caliber of Soviet heavy field artillery. And of course, the Ukrainian army uses this caliber for its field artillery. Now here is the interesting bit. Even though this facility was captured by Russian forces only a few days ago, the fact that this storage facility was so close to the front lines, well within artillery range, within the area that drones usually fly and conduct reconnaissance about, meant that Ukrainian forces were unable to access it for some time already. And as a direct result, Ukraine has very little ammunition for its heavy artillery. And this is the reason why Western countries are in such a hurry to deliver heavy artillery to Ukraine. That way, the Ukrainian army will at least have some artillery to work with, even if it's only 100 or 200 field artillery guns and multiple launch rocket systems. The United States has announced yesterday that they will be and already are in the process of delivering their multiple launch rocket systems to the Ukrainian army. And the collective West will also be delivering something on the order of 200,000 rounds for all of this artillery. Of course, the big problem is that NATO artillery uses a different caliber from Soviet artillery, 155mm versus 152mm. They are not compatible with one another, meaning that it's not possible to use NATO munitions in Soviet guns and vice versa. And the other problem to add to this is that there is no infrastructure to maintain any of this equipment. There is no infrastructure to repair or replace any parts. Meaning that once any of this equipment is put out of action, it's either going to have to be shipped back through the western borders of Ukraine and into the European Union to be repaired, or it's going to have to be abandoned. In any case, Ukraine has no choice but to start using this artillery, meaning that they are going to have to transfer from using Soviet artillery to using NATO artillery very quickly. Another very interesting development is the fact that Moldova, an allegedly neutral country, a country that according to its own constitution is supposed to be neutral, has just begun delivering enormous supplies of fuel to Ukraine. I haven't seen any official figures. I don't believe there are any as of right now as to the amount of fuel that is being delivered to Ukraine via Moldova, but unofficial figures, witnesses on the ground, suggest a truly enormous amount. These witnesses say that once every half hour or so, a massive convoy like the one that you are seeing on the screen right now is departing towards Ukraine. So we are talking about tens of thousands of tons of fuel every single day. And one would have to be hopelessly naive to think that the primary recipient of all of these fuel deliveries is going to be anyone but the Ukrainian military. I've talked a lot about Russia's clear attempts to deprive the Ukrainian military of fuel on this channel. Now, unless these fuel deliveries are not interrupted, this attempt to starve the Ukrainian military of fuel is going to fail. Now, the way that Russia can interrupt these fuel deliveries and at the same time interrupt any weapons deliveries is by bombing Ukrainian railroad infrastructure, something that they have almost completely refrained from doing. And the reason that I say almost completely as opposed to completely is because over the last few days, we've received reports that exactly 4 railroad links which connect western Ukraine to eastern Ukraine, that is to say, the railroads that cross over the Dnieper River, have been targeted by the Russian Air Force. Now, needless to say, there is a lot more than 4 railroad links that cross the Dnieper River, and these 4 railroad links that have been bombed up until now can be repaired relatively quickly because the bridges themselves were not targeted. And of course, there is also the fact that Russia likely won't stop at the Dnieper River. Of course, without railroads, there is no way to deliver all of this heavy equipment, all of these vast supplies of munitions and fuel, from the borders of West Ukraine all the way to the contact line in the Donbass, or really to any location east of the Dnieper River. So all of this puts more and more pressure on the Russian Air Force to start targeting Ukrainian railroad links. Now, I don't know whether we will see any sort of massive campaign targeting railroad links left, right, and center all throughout Ukraine, but something like targeting the few railroad links that transit the Dnieper River, or possibly even destroying the bridges that connect the shores of the Dnieper River, is something that is, if anything, very likely. Speaking of Russia's goals in this war, the Russian Ministry of Defense came out with a statement yesterday stating that the goals of the second phase of its operation in Ukraine are to establish full control over the Donbass and over southern Ukraine. This, of course, presumably means Zaporozhye, Kherson Oblast, which is already under full control of the Russian military, but also Mykolaiv and Odessa Oblast. All of these regions are much more culturally and linguistically aligned with Russia than the rest of Ukraine is, which is why Russia is presumably targeting them. However, there is also the distinct possibility that this statement was made just to disorient and confuse the Ukrainian government. This could make Ukraine expect some sort of massive offensive in Mykolaiv Oblast, which, by the way, has seen lots and lots of artillery shelling and airstrikes targeting Ukrainian positions. However, such an offensive might never come. It might all just be a feint meant to force the Ukrainian government to keep a part of its forces in this area, while the main bulk of Russia's forces is concentrated in the Donbass region. Whether or not that is the case, we will see. Another interesting development in this war. We know that the Ukrainian side claims that they have only lost about 3,000 military personnel, which is about 1/10 of what Russia claims Ukraine has lost. In other words, there is a huge discrepancy in the loss figures that are presented by the Russian and the Ukrainian side. By the way, I should point out that this figure, 3,000, and the Russian figure that is claimed, which is 10 times that, is about the number of soldiers killed in action. If we were to include wounded and prisoners of war, the figure would be roughly 3 times higher. And an observation on my part. Ukrainian claims of their own losses are absolutely ridiculous. Ukraine has objectively lost more soldiers in Mariupol alone than they claim to have lost everywhere in the entire war. Russian accounts of Ukrainian losses are a lot more plausible, and I suspect that they are a lot closer to the truth. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily correct or that they're fully accurate, doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat them with a grain of salt, but in any case, they are clearly much more plausible and likely much closer to the truth than the Ukrainian figures are. Now, in light of the discrepancy between loss figures claimed by the Ukrainian and the Russian sides, the Russian Ministry of Defense has begun to publish a series of documents claiming to show the burial site and reveal various other information about dead Ukrainian servicemen who, according to Ukraine, are still alive. Anyways, this is not exactly new. This has been going on for about a week now. Another update which is connected to this that I wanted to discuss is that today, April 23rd, is, to my knowledge, the first day that the Russian Ministry of Defense has published figures of Ukrainian deserters. These documents show the number of deserters of the Ukrainian National Guard. Now, Russia claims that it has captured these documents, and presumably it has only captured documents detailing the deserters of the Ukrainian National Guard, and not the Ukrainian army. The figures suggest that 861 soldiers have deserted from the Ukrainian National Guard. Of course, the National Guard is about 1/3 of the size of the Ukrainian army. All of these documents, by the way, can be found online. The Russian Ministry of Defense is openly publishing them. Of course, that does not mean that they're valid. Their validity should be questioned since Russia is not an impartial actor in this war. Some of the information offered by these documents is indisputable. For example, they might state the coordinates of the grave of some particular Ukrainian soldier. However, when it comes to information such as the number of deserters from the Ukrainian army, all it is basically just a list of various brigades, battalions, with a number next to them alleging how many soldiers have deserted from that particular unit. So it's worth treating this information with a bit of skepticism. However, it is without a doubt that there are some deserters from the Ukrainian military, especially since that military is made up primarily of conscripts and draftees. And many soldiers understand perfectly well that they are up against an overwhelmingly superior fighting force. So all of the reasons for a soldier to desert are there. If these figures are true and we were to use them to extrapolate the number of deserters from the Ukrainian army, which again is roughly 3 times bigger than the Ukrainian National Guard, and not counting units such as the Territorial Defense Forces, which are made up entirely of draftees and is a paramilitary organization, where I expect the number of deserters to be much higher, we would get a figure of roughly 3,000 deserters from February 24th. Now, on one hand, this isn't that much. This isn't a critical number where the entire Ukrainian military has basically deserted. This is only about 1%, maybe a little bit more than 1% of the total military. But on the other hand, it's another figure that is worth keeping in mind when considering Ukrainian losses. Of course, some might also say that Russian losses should also be considered in the same manner, and that is true. Out of a force of more than 200,000 soldiers, it is very likely that at least one at some point has deserted. But on the other hand, the Russian military in Ukraine isn't made up of conscripts, isn't fighting an overwhelmingly superior force, and isn't losing. So, logically speaking, the number of deserters on the Russian side should be at least an order of magnitude less. And most likely it is much more than just one order of magnitude. And the last thing that I will mention in this video is a statement by the head of the Ukrainian National Security Council, Alexei Danilov, who said that the Kerch Strait Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland and stretches for about 20 kilometers, could be targeted by Ukrainian missiles. Now, the reason that Ukraine hasn't done so already is because the Kerch Strait Bridge is about 200 kilometers from any territory that was controlled by Ukraine prior to February 24th. And given that the entire coastline of the Sea of Azov is now controlled by Russian forces, the distance from the Kerch Strait Bridge to any piece of land that is controlled by the Ukrainian government is more like 300 kilometers. Of course, this is well outside the range of any Ukrainian missiles. However, here is where America's delivery of multiple launch rocket systems comes into play. The multiple launch rocket systems that the United States is planning to deliver to Ukraine are most likely going to include the M142 HIMARS. These rocket artillery systems have a maximum range of about 70 kilometers, but they can be equipped with a ballistic missile that has a range of 300 kilometers. And there has been talk within the United States of giving the Ukrainian military these kinds of weapon systems, to give them ballistic missiles that can target Russian strategic infrastructure that is far away from the front lines and well within Russia's borders. This is something that the collective West has the physical ability to do. They can provide these kinds of weapon systems to the Ukrainian military, which can then use it to target various important Russian infrastructure such as the Kerch Strait Bridge. Of course, doing so would lead to a massive escalation of the war. At that point, Russia will almost certainly cease refraining from targeting Ukrainian railroad links, Ukrainian power stations, and various government facilities such as the Ukrainian Rada. So that is definitely something to watch out for. I don't know if the United States or any other country of the collective West will risk escalating the conflict so far, but it is a distinct possibility. So those are some of the important developments that have happened in the Ukraine war, roughly from the period of April 20th to today, which is April 23rd. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, as always, please leave a like, it helps the algorithm, and also please be sure to check out my other channels on Rumble and on Telegram. The links to both will, as always, be in the video description and in the comments. And if you're already watching this video on Rumble, first of all, a huge thumbs up to you. Rumble is an amazing platform, has no political censorship whatsoever, and the links in the video description will be to my YouTube and Telegram channels. Finally, a quick word about Telegram. There are a lot of channels discussing and posting content related to the Ukraine war on Telegram. Telegram is probably the best platform to get updates on the Ukraine war. Now, I'm not saying that my Telegram channel has a bunch of updates on the Ukraine war, which I post regularly. It doesn't. I don't have time for that, unfortunately. However, if anybody wants to keep a close eye on this war, I strongly recommend finding a Telegram channel that does post regular updates, or even subscribe to multiple Telegram channels. So that is all that I wanted to say today. I thank you for watching this video and wish you all a wonderful day.